And for the purpose of the recording and the transcript, I'd be grateful if everyone who speaks could ensure that you state your name and your role. If we can begin with introductions, I am Deputy Helen Miles, Chair of the Corporate Services Scrutiny Panel.
David Johnson, Constable St Mary, panel member.
Deputy Ina Gardiner, Chair of the Public Accounts Committee.
Deputy Max Andrews, a panel member.
Deputy Alex Curtis, panel member.
Elaine Miller, Minister for Treasury and Resources.
Richard Bell, Treasurer.
Cora O'Brien, Deputy Controller.
Andy Hackwell, Group Director of Strategic Finance.
Lovely, thank you very much. We have quite a lot of questions today. It's quite a significant question plan. So if we could just be conscious of time in your responses, please. Just try to be focused. So the first person I'm going to hand over is to Deputy Gardiner, who's going to ask some questions around financial sustainability.
Thank you, Chair. And we'll start with FPP Annual Report 2024, which emphasised the need of government to focus on medium term while making choices to balance between spending against investing in the future and restoring island reserves. What specific methods have been used to develop forecasts for short term?
Thinking about medium term, it's probably more 5 to 12 years, so slightly further out than that, and then long term would be further on. So there's actually 2 projects within the Treasury at the moment. They're included in the business plan for 2024, which has been published around longer term planning. The first of which is the long-term capital plan, so knowing how much we need to spend on our assets, not just in the 4-year window of the government plan, but looking out much further, up to 25 years. And similarly, we've got a piece going on around long-term financial planning or longer-term financial planning, which is looking at not just capital, but also revenue expenditure, and what the impact on reserves and borrowing would be into that longer term. So that's work that is ongoing in year. It was with the change in the timeline for getting the government plan done. We've had to pick it up slightly later in the year than originally planned, but that is a really important piece of work to mean that we've got more tools as we go into future budget processes where we can see, well, what is the longer term focus. However, there's lots of... Sorry, did you have a...
No. I think it's really important to hear that we have 2 projects, plans going or developing, which is capitals and long-term financial planning. If I understood correct, it hasn't been finished before this budget was presented, but would we see it in the next budget, the indications and how it will be reflected?
I think in reality, both of those pieces of work will iterate, so they will improve as we go over time. So you'll run it once, check how it works, and then potentially improve it. But there should be something that's able to be used for the next budget. I guess what I just caveat that with is there is still lots of things that go in that have more of a focus on the medium term and long term, which these plans are bringing together. So, for example, in capital, there are condition surveys that are in place. There is a pipeline of works which maybe didn't quite make it into the government plan, but we know about will be happening. So it's pulling that together in a way that can be used. Similarly, on longer term financial planning, we have actuarial reviews of the social security funds. We have a piece of work around what is likely to happen to healthcare costs moving into the future. What are the projections in terms of what happens with an ageing population? So there's already lots of work going on in that space. These projects are more bringing all of those together to a single piece that can then be used to inform that decision making as we go into budgets.
Okay, I think interesting that you mentioned there are some capitals that didn't make into this plan. And I think during the public hearing with the infrastructure minister about the budget, it has been mentioned there are some projects that might come forward during the year. Is it, I'm looking at Alex because Deputy Curtis, because they were included. So how does it really work? So what we have in front of us, and if it will be changed during the year, what does it mean?
To give a specific example from the hearing that the Environment, Housing and Infrastructure panel had with the Minister for Infrastructure, it was highlighted that there was funding for a skate park allocated in 2028 under the estates table, but the Minister identified he was confident that he would be able to fund that sooner and that he had the assurances of the Treasury Minister. So I think that's what Deputy Gardiner is referring to.
I can pick that up if you like, Minister. So if you want to vary in year, obviously there's an established process where the Minister has powers to reallocate money between heads of expenditure. I have to remind myself, but we also have grouped heads of expenditure, and one of the rationales for that is that if projects are able to come on stream earlier, they can be moved backwards and forwards slightly, but still you wouldn't be able to do it if it wasn't. So the skate park is mentioned in the government plan. If it was a matter of timing, that's something that could be potentially reallocated. It's all around trying to actually make sure that we do spend the capital to improve assets. So if the skate park is ready but another project isn't, it might be far better to be able to switch the order of them in year. But we're very transparent around how that actually manifests, either through ministerial decisions or through reports.
If I'm coming back to the first question, and going back to the Minister, thank you. Minister, do you believe there is appropriate balance in this current budget between spending for what we need now to actually invest into the future?
Well, that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to do. And I think the FPP itself recognised there are challenges between current spend, balancing, investment into productive capacity and long-term, topping up reserves. We have tried to address that. We have started off that process in terms of, we have said, ministers were told, don't come with a whole load of growth bids, like we didn't have the process that we had last year. So people weren't coming with bids for more money and more employees. Out with the only kind of new money was for the CSP priorities. So we have tried to, everybody has been asked to go away and work within the money they already have and prioritise. So that's a very good start. We have made a good start towards earmarking funds for the Strategic Reserve and the Stabilisation Fund. So we have started a plan there. And yes, we are trying to look forward, and we have an obligation that the budget has to take into account long-term sustainability and well-being. So that's kind of first principle, and we are trying to that is definitely something that we have taken into account in terms of trying to start topping up the reserves. It's not something we can do overnight, but we have a clear plan to start building both the Strategic Reserve and Stabilisation Fund, as well as trying to balance spend.
Can you give me examples of specific measures that have been taken, that you have started to do this, to build and maintain financial reserves?
Well, I need to go and look because I always get it confused. We have a plan. The strategic reserve, for example, will get the prior year basis.
Prior basis receipts.
So
have
the
now
prior
been
year
earmarked.
basis receipts will have been earmarked, and those will go into the strategic reserve. Now, as those receipts come in, which they're coming in already at the rate of, I think from memory, about £5 million a year. And that will increase. I think there's about 300 million outstanding. So we should maybe shy of 300 million outstanding from what we've already received. So as that money is received, that will go into the strategic reserve. We're earmarking funds from Pillar 2 to go into the Stabilisation Fund. And to the extent that we have underspends from this year, we're looking to put those are going to the Stabilisation Fund as well, aren't they? So in terms of building up the reserve, we have a plan. Future Pillar 2 monies will be devoted to reserves other than fund, we've already said what we've spent Pillar 2 monies on. So we have a clear plan to do that.
So Pillar 2, all money going into the Stabilisation Fund or into the Strategic Reserve?
Not all of it. Again, I'm sorry, I can't remember which is going to be.
The government plan sets out a framework for receipts from Pillar 2. They are within the base case, but also in the event that receipts above that base prudent estimate are received, and rebuilding reserves, and in particular the Stabilisation Fund, is one of the uses of excess receipts should they be received.
So, in simple words, the receipts that will be received from Pillar 2 going into Stabilisation Fund, or they will be used for something else as well? Just to make it clear.
So the plan sets out a number of uses for those funds that could be considered. They could be investment in infrastructure, and they could be investment in, into the reserves. And the order of putting them in reserves would firstly be stabilisation fund before you consider further
not-
down
no,
the line
it's
in
not-
terms of that.
Okay.
But also that excess returns would be used to fund the new hospital project as well.
Okay, it will be. What, the FEP highlighted the rate growth of healthcare spending is not sustainable. How will existing work on sustainability for the health funding is developing and will inform long-term sustainability of the financials?
Well, as it is, it clearly needs to be the funding, the spend in health needs to have a very high focus, because this year we are looking at very significant overspends. That's not sustainable. So I think there is ongoing work to look at how we control that spend properly. And again, you're talking about what drugs do you provide people, what operations do you provide people, so that is a very difficult subject. But there is work there with the turnaround team. We've also got the financial recovery plan, which will offset over a slightly elongated period. That will offset some of the overspend. But yes, we absolutely have to have a focus on health spending going forward. It is high. There are numerous reasons why it's high, because health inflation is affecting everybody. The whole demographic issue is affecting, we're not alone in finding increasing costs in health, but we do need to make sure that we are controlling those costs as best we can.
Okay, another one, a recommendation from FPP in respect of...
So I can't see you then, Johnson.
Sorry. I wasn't sure because I can see. No worries. Sorry. The recommendation was done by FPP in 24-27, which also recommended by the previous panel. It's not to provide unspecified savings in the budget. And obviously it has been reiterated by FPP again. What is your view in that regard? And this budget estimates approximately, if I'm correct, 4 million of unspecified savings? So we are doing savings, but we don't know where they're coming from, the unspecified.
Well, that's for the department. The departments are...
Which departments, if they're not
Sorry,
specified?
Sorry, I thought you were talking about health. If you
No,
you're
I'm
talking
more-
about something else.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So to clarify, there's 4 million of savings it's 3 million in 26 and 1 million in 27, which haven't yet been allocated to departments. So that's obviously a much smaller number than it has been in previous plans. There are amounts allocated in 26 and 27 to departments already, whereas previous plans, the whole amount would generally be.
But it was very clear from FPP at the previous year, and they said again this year, you're not suggesting not to put in the budget savings that we have no idea where they're coming from. So why are we having this again in the budget?
So I would say that in particular for 2025, the plan is more specific than it has been in previous years for the immediate year of the government plan, and it's taken a slightly different approach rather than just pro rata cuts across the board. Those include plans in respect of arm's length organisation, back office functions, not front office functions for those, but in particular office savings. So the business case for the office programme had benefits. We are realising those benefits in terms of savings. Those will be delivered over the years of the plan. And then in year one, we've planned figures for year two being 2026. In year one, there is an approach agreed by the Council of Ministers that they will try, wherever possible, to protect the front line. The savings are pointed towards savings in the back office by looking at delayering management, principally in the back office functions, or not the front line functions, in terms of delayering management, removing vacancies, and reducing reliance upon consultancy and contingent labour. So those are quite specific in 2025, more specific than they have, I would challenge, than in previous years. The amounts that remain unallocated are relatively small amounts into future years, as I can't remember his full title, so I'll just say Andrew just said. It's a relatively minor amount compared to the
Yes,
overall
in the
programme.
context of a spend of almost 1.3 billion, 4 million is a very, very small amount.
It's very
so
helpful
to
that we got the specifications. Is it anywhere in the budget that made this clarity how the 4 million unspecified? What you just presented to us, is it anywhere in the documents that I missed?
Are you on the page?
So page 48, there is a very short paragraph around future
It's very short,
savings,
yeah, okay.
which
So-
basically says there's 4 million that will be allocated in the future, but it reiterates the Council Minister's view that these additional savings are very achievable based on the scale of departmental budgets of 1.2 billion.
So we got a bit more information now where it's coming from, because there is lots of details that we cannot get from.
I was
Lovely,
talking
thank you.
specifically
Thank you.
25, 26,
Which is set out on page 47.
which is set out.
Thank you.
Just moving on, I got some questions about the general revenue income and the budget proposals. Can you just talk to us about the level of stakeholder consultation that was undertaken when deciding on the thresholds and the allowances and the excise duties, etc.?
Well, we consult very widely in terms of budget measures, so we go out to a number of groups in the, I think it must have been the spring, well, the closing date was, we had about 5 weeks to consult, so we go out to people like the Law Society, Age Concern, Chamber of Commerce, Children's Commissioner, Charity Commissioner, Institute of Directors, JACS, Jersey Landlords Association, Consumer Council, Jersey Business, CIOT, I'm not sure who that is, and the JSCCA, which is the accountancy body. We also include agriculture, construction, retail, property finance, legal and digital. So we do consult very widely on all tax changes. I'm not sure if that necessarily led, that's what, about tax policy more generally, what we might do in terms of, you know, changes to tax, is the structure right? And they do come back with suggestions, and we've worked through those suggestions with them. Some of them have come through and some haven't.
So did the consultation process kind of look like you writing to these people and inviting them to
Yes.
submit their opinions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we do write
Because I
to
think
them.
we've received some views that kind of proper consultation didn't take place this year, and that it appeared to be more of an exercise of providing the government's views or likely decisions to stakeholders rather than a proper consultation on views.
Well, that may be people who just feel that, I think we do consult, without telling me where you think the gap is, I can't really answer that, but I've had meetings with some of those bodies. The officers certainly have had meetings with those bodies, and it may be that they just don't like the outcome rather than they weren't consulted without further detail.
Did the shortened timeline in preparing the budget to lodge the proposed budget sooner in August have any impact at all on the consultation process?
I wouldn't say so, Chair. So in kind of early March, the controller wrote to a very wide range of organisations, as the Minister said. So that was still in plenty of time, and a number of them did come back, and that led to follow-up meetings. So, and on particular topics, there was then a lot more detailed consultation.
Thank you. How have you agreed? How have the agreed and implemented budget measures from the last year's plan, 24 to 27, being monitored across 2024 to understand the impact that those proposals had on islanders and businesses and the economy in general?
So, if we're talking AMPER duties, those are straightforward in terms of the freezes from previous years. Any implications relating to long-term health would obviously take a long time to be felt, arising from reducing in real terms duties. The holding down of duty rises are fairly mathematically evident in terms of they're not contributing to the additional costs in the economy. Therefore, you could say that you are, and I mean, indeed, we would have done in illustrating how much if you increase them by inflation, that would have contributed to the rate of inflation.
Okay, so that's okay, thank you. Has any analysis on the inflationary impact of excise duties been undertaken to model how revenue-raising measures actually affect businesses.
So in terms of duties in making the decisions, we generally, when we're talking about rises to, in real terms, to AMPA duties, are able, through the economics unit, to say what the consequent increase would be to the RPI.
Okay, thank you.
And it,
Just to add to that response, the previous Treasury Minister did introduce an innovation credit as well for businesses, and that is something that we will be careful in monitoring when we get the tax returns in, just to see how was the take up of that, and was it kind of scoped
In the right way.
Yes, and I suppose there are things we'll take. So is that like the fintech?
Yeah.
Yes, so the fintech thing, that will take a time to
work its way
flow through.
Yeah.
That may take a year or two to flow through till we see the impact of
Okay,
that.
thank you. In terms of personal taxation and exemption thresholds then, how does the increase in our personal allowances compare with other jurisdictions, sort of UK and Guernsey, and what impact is that likely to have on the competitiveness of our tax system?
Well, our personal tax threshold, we believe, is bigger than any jurisdiction nearby. With the increase, we've made an increase which will bring it to £20,700. I believe it's something like 15,000 in Guernsey and slightly lower in the UK.
Proposals
Guernsey,
Guernsey
we've only
proposals
just
are
seen
to
those
increase it
changes.
to 15,000. So ours is starting off from 20,000. So our base is already significantly higher than a lot of other jurisdictions.
Yes, but it's difficult just to focus on the exemption threshold because there are so many other things impact on it. But our personal tax and for single people and married people is considerably higher than it is in the UK. In fact, we think most other.
12,750.
So how was it decided then that the percentage increase in the threshold would be effective at alleviating the kind of continued cost of living pressure?
Well, it was, we did this. We did, because of the timescale, the budget was, we had done a lot of work on the budget before the RPI figures came out. So we'd worked on the previous forecast figures from the FPP, was it? Yeah. FPP figures. And then when the inflation came out, the cost of increasing it would have been, it would have been money that would have to have been found from elsewhere. So given that we have a rate that is some £5,000 more than anyone else, we didn't think it was necessary to increase it right up in line with inflation.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand you over to Deputy Andrews now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Moving on to alcohol duties, the panel is aware that the Council of Ministers have proposed that alcohol duties are frozen for the calendar year 2025. And I want to know the economic and social perspective of the Council of Ministers for coming up with that decision, and also what will the impact be from a Treasury perspective as well?
Well, in terms of the decision to freeze, that was one of the CSP priorities, is to try and keep government fees and duties as low as we can. That turns out to be more difficult than you might initially think. You think, well, we can just not raise anything. So, but alcohol and fuel duty are things that they also feed in very directly to things like cost of living crisis and inflation. So it is a very difficult balancing act because there's all kinds of policy impact. It's been frozen it's either been frozen or increased below inflation for the last 5 years. So it is a pattern that previous governments have followed. But, we have to accept there are concerns about alcohol particularly. But there is, you mentioned that, with consultation, people feel they haven't been heard. Equally, hospitality would have us not charge any duty on alcohol, which we have got to recognise there is a cost to alcohol in terms of policing the nighttime economy, health impacts. So I think it's right that there is some duty on alcohol.
Yeah.
But in terms of the impact on government.
The table on page 34 of the budget summarises the impact upon revenues arising from freezing alcohol duty as opposed to and fuel duty as opposed to increasing them in line with the RPI, which is what we have in the forecast that's developed by the Income Forecasting Group. So the consequences of not doing so are in the table on page 34.
Thank you. Sorry, Minister. In relation to freezing alcohol duties, some would say, well, in fact, if you're to increase the rates, then potentially you'd be discouraging consumption of alcohol. And also you have to take into account we have an issue with overspend in health. So how was it that you came to the decision to maintain alcohol consumption when some people would actually say that it's a negative externality?
I absolutely agree, and I absolutely understand that point. But equally, our hospitality sector are always telling us that they are really struggling, and that every time we put duties up, that is, well, they tend to suggest bigger price rises than actually is the increase in duty. But if you have an economic sector that says they will really struggle, so you're balancing the health of a sector of the economy with cost of living on individuals, with the ongoing costs of alcohol. And I would like to think that this is a temporary measure, and that as we get over the cost of living, we would like to think the cost of living issues will diminish in the next couple of years, and that we will revert to increasing, go back to previous practices of increasing alcohol duties more in line with inflation. But it is a very difficult balancing act when we do have the hospitality sector telling us they're struggling.
And similarly, I just wanted to touch on the freeze on fuel duties, because in the Fiscal Policy Panel report, there was no mention of how we would fund the transition to net zero. And obviously we've got a freeze, and usually there would be more funds going into the Climate Emergency Fund to facilitate expenditure. So how did you come to that decision? And in any future government plan, will we see an increase in fuel duties to try and fund climate emergency initiatives?
It's a very similar argument, Deputy. Yes, fuel duty is still there. It's frozen, so there is still some money going into the carbon neutral roadmap. But again, it's a balance with cost of living pressures. There are lots of people relying on their cars still, until such times as people have stopped using their cars. And there are also small businesses. There are lots of small businesses, the care sector particularly, gardeners, cleaners who rely on vehicles, not just members of the public. So it is trying to look at the wider economic impacts of increasing fuel duties, and it is, Deputy Miles asked earlier on about addressing cost of living, and that is one of the ways we're trying to do it. So it's a difficult balance to reach.
And we tend to be seeing more of a consumer shift, for instance, when we're looking at, say, electric vehicles. And of course, there will be a reduced level of income in terms of when we're looking at, say, fuel duties. So do you think there will be any plans that will be brought forward in any future government plan to try and increase revenue to initiate climate emergency initiatives?
Yes, that is something that is, I think we mentioned that in the budget. It is something there that it's clearly something we're aware of, a fuel duty replacement policy. We've had several meetings about it this year in terms of looking at what the options are. There is no perfect option in terms of how you do that. Do you do the two kind of principal ways of replacing fuel duty are either to add a vehicle ownership charge, which says for every car you own, you pay X amount. And there will be some people who have 8 cars who don't have a problem with that. But then there will be people who have one car, maybe older people with one car they use once a week to do their shopping. And it's that, the other kind of obvious example, which I think is in London, they do number plate. It's a mileage charge. Now places like London, they can do that by number plate recognition technology. New Zealand have got trackers in vehicles. Introducing those types of technologies in a small island would be difficult, so that's equally challenging. So we are working through those. But what we discussed it quite recently, and the economic analysis at the moment is that while fuel duty is declining and use of those fuels are in decline, they are not declining as rapidly as we thought. You know, it's not a,
I say it's not
it's a very much more gradual. So the, if you like, the urgency of replacing fuel duty isn't as marked as we may have thought it was. So there is a decline, but it's
not immediate.
it's not something that is immediate
Okay,
cause for
no,
concern.
thank you for
but
that
it is on
confirmation.
our agenda, and it is something we're continuing to work through.
Can I ask, what impact has the tobacco duties had on consumption? And from a Treasury perspective, will we be seeing any changes in the near future in future government plans to potentially maybe increase future, tobacco duties or potentially to maintain them?
I think we have my understanding is that we have a kind of, we have a sort of established process for tobacco duty in that it rises. Cora, you're probably better explaining that.
Yeah, so there's an escalator. So the tobacco increase this time was the 3.6% estimated June RPI plus a 5% escalator.
Yep.
And that is something that we tend to do in most years. So you'll generally see rises above the inflation rate for tobacco. There is monitoring that happens in the economy unit around the impact on consumption.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can find the details if you need that.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I know
I think just on consumption, I've just got a note that the Opinions and Lifestyle Survey suggests that smoking fell by nearly 9 percentage points among 16 to 34-year-olds between 2020 and 2023. So, although again that may be a statistic, they may be smoking less, but equally we know we've got concerns about young people and vaping. So, and again, to go back very briefly to Deputy Mill's question on consultation, there is a Tobacco Importers and Manufacturers Association who do write to us, but we are legally, there are frameworks that says we should not engage with them in terms of tax policy.
Okay.
So
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Switching for me to stamp duty, in particular first-time buyers, what consideration discussions have taken place on stamp duty structures in respect of those first-time buyers when preparing the budget?
I don't think there were specific changes in this budget, but we did make, my memory says the threshold was increased during the year. I think it probably is picked up in the budget, but it wasn't a change as a consequence of this budget.
First-time buyers in this budget.
No, but it has increased. I think the threshold in previous budgets. So that there is first-time buyer stamp duty is not part of this budget. There was no change.
Can I just ask a question there, David? Sorry.
Yes, carry on, yes.
The first-time buyers has got a dead stop at 700,000. So if somebody is a first-time buyer and they buy a property at 710,000, they then pay the stamp duty on the full 710,000. Has there been any consideration of kind of staggering that so that you've got kind of an upper cap? So if you buy a property at 710,000, you just pay the stamp duty on the 10,000 up to a maximum limit.
I don't know. Have we talked about that? I think we've just that we there was quite a significant uplift to 700. It went from
500 to 700.
Yeah, so that's a very significant uplift, and I would have thought the number of first-time buyers buying a property over 700,000 would be quite limited. And part of my kind of gut reaction to that is if you're buying a property at £700,000, then you should probably be able to pay the stamp duty. You know, first-time buyers, you would think people are buying one-bedroom flats, two-bedroom houses. 700,000 seems quite a big property for a first-time buyer.
Thank you.
So,
Okay, thanks.
but we haven't discussed that more fully.
Not discussed it, thank you.
Not with me anyway.
More generally, going back to the fiscal policy panel, thank you for that, report, we note in the annual report that they say that housing affordability has not materially changed as the fall in house prices has been offset by the higher mortgage costs. Now, is that something you accept? in fact? And if that is so, what impact is this having on stamp duty revenues?
Impact on stamp duty revenues, do you have?
Yeah, so
the changes?
we've obviously
That's quite a difficult question.
reduced the stamp duty forecasts arising from the downturn in the market in the last year or so. The forecast in year is not forecast in year is not a million miles from that which we base this forecast on. Of course, interest rates are falling or are due to be falling, and we would anticipate that reductions in interest rates will lead to greater market activity in future years.
It's just straying on to my next question, and thank you for that. How you're adapting your forecasts to the slower return to pre-pandemic housing market activity. I suspect that is a long way away, but you're anticipating an increase in activity because of the...
Yeah, so we use the FPP's forecasts increases in the number of transactions or increases in activity, and rebase that against where we see the market currently. So we base it on current figures and apply the increases that the FPP forecasts.
Yeah, and again, back to your earlier point, obviously with rumoured interest rate cuts in the offing, you're expecting much more activity in 2025?
I would see it rise. If I turn to the right page, they'll tell me exactly what the percentage increases are, but it's in the FPP tables, so they do anticipate an increase in transactions as interest rates reduce.
Okay.
I think the market did bounce back very quickly after the pandemic, but I think in the last couple of years, there have been numerous factors affecting it, but I think interest rates, which we can't really control, have been the biggest one. And as those come down, we would hope the market will pop back up.
Okay.
Because people don't want to sell their property at less than they think it's worth.
I appreciate the yes, that. But they could buy one at a similar discount, couldn't they? Moving on to aircraft, private aircraft and carbon tax. What criteria has been considered to determine an appropriate carbon tax on private aircraft?
Again, that is something that, my notes are, it's something that's under consideration. We have had we've had some preliminary discussions with the Minister for the Environment in terms of how that might be structured. I am aware that separately, what we said in the budget, we have got something in the, so we are looking at that. We are aware Jersey ports are looking at something as well. And I have spoken to them, quite recently and said, we need to be very coordinated on this. I think they are talking to officers. So it's a policy and development.
I mean, you mentioned Jersey ports. So have been other stakeholders you've consulted with as to the impact on, i.e. both to see where it fits in the carbon strategy generally and with other nations' goals?
So we are consulting internally very closely with the environment colleagues and the ministers met the Minister for the Environment. There is a piece of work around what we might do on this area, and it has been programmed into our schedule for consultation over the coming months. So we would, if we were doing something like that, we would consult with a wide range of stakeholders who could be affected by it.
Okay, is it under consideration? And you say over the coming months, do you envisage getting or coming up with any sort of proposition during 2025?
It would
we certainly will
probably
be
not
doing
come
the
in
review.
before 26.
Yeah, so we will be doing the review. We're doing the review at the minute in the tax policy team, so that will continue sort of from now through into the first quarter of 2025, and then we will write a report for the Minister to consider with the Council of Ministers and decide what to do from there.
Okay, I'm sure the Environment Scrutiny Panel will look forward to receiving the result. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. It's, as I say, it's policy and development. And there may be numerous different ways of addressing
Okay, thank you.
aircraft, air travel.
Thank you. I had some questions on fuel duty replacement, but I think some of them have been answered in your answers to Deputy Andrews. So I won't ask those clearly, but again, it comes back to some consultation. And stakeholders have raised concerns with the panel regarding the future measures and early awareness of any changes that might be sought. So what are your plans to communicate changes with stakeholders in a timely manner so that they understand the implications of any fuel duty replacement policies?
Well, we will consult with people. I mean, we do consult with them, and it will be part of our process.
We've sorry.
Sorry, Chair. On something like that, which would have widespread impact on the island, we would do a public consultation as and when we got to a point to put out a consultation document with either options or suggested approach. That would be something that would go to full public consultation.
We've had a submission from the Jersey Motor Traders Association, and they have specifically requested that your commitment to a full consultation process rather than what they feel is being presented with a fait accompli.
Well, I think that's an unfair comment. I have met with them. We have written to them. I met with them on things like VED, and as Cora said, that is such a wide-ranging issue. Of course, there would be full consultation about it.
Okay, thank you for that undertaking.
Yeah, a very brief one. We understand that, or we know that consideration is being given to removing tax relief on interest for properties which are let by landlords.
Yes.
Can you update us as to where you are on that, please?
We've been looking at that. That was an amendment brought by Deputy Mezek before he was Housing Minister. So I have met with Deputy Mezek to discuss how that might work. We did a couple of questions about it. But the proposition as amended required us to do three things, which was to look at the FPP report into the housing market in Jersey. We now have that report, but it doesn't really help in terms of that particular issue. So that box is ticked, if you like. But it also required us to do an analysis of timing and cumulative impact on the market, which we will be starting in fairly early course, early next year. And it requires us to do a consultation. So the consultation will be starting in Q1 2025. Because also we have to balance with all the other work and consultation we're doing. So that consultation will take place next year. We will then develop the scheme, and I wouldn't envisage it coming in before 2026.
Okay, think of that.
So it is under development and under consultation.
As an aside, I happened to see a report in yesterday's press that in the UK they were, in the context of increasing capital gains tax, they were going to exempt private residences and rented property as well, which I assume from that they are concerned about the rental market being less vigorous than it was in the past, and I presume that's the general area you're looking at, that other legislation coming in, it is alleged that it might reduce the rental market.
I think the principle was to create, I believe the principle that the Deputy was trying to achieve was to create a level playing field between homeowners and landlords.
I accept that, yeah.
And there will be a cumulative impact on the market. That's why the amendment was made by the previous government, that we had to consider cumulative impact of things like various other initiatives that may affect the rental market. But we're preempting what the consultation outcomes are going to be.
I'm sure Scrutiny will look forward to receiving a
I'm
report
sure
on that as well.
you will see details in due course.
Yeah, and Constable, just to reassure you that so Revenue Jersey is holding the pen on writing that consultation document, but we are working very closely with both housing colleagues and the economy team in terms of it wouldn't, if it was to happen, it wouldn't just be a tax change, it would obviously have wider economic impact. So it's very important that any consultation document that goes out there also takes into consideration what the potential impacts of different measures might be on the housing market and the wider economy.
Okay, and we will have the advantage of the new housing law by that stage, rental provisions during the course of next year, I presume, as well.
And it needs to be taken in the round, doesn't it? So all of these measures kind of
Okay,
That's it.
thanks for assurance, thank you.
Thank you. Hand you back to Deputy Andrews, I think.
Thank you very much, Chair. Minister, the panel is aware that vaping products are currently being worked on within your department, potentially for a future government budget. And I was wondering whether you could provide the panel with an update on that work.
Again, we've had some discussions on that this year. It is something that I would like to do. I do think it's something we need to address. We have to recognise the Minister for Environment is looking at a ban, I believe, on disposable vaping products. There's some view that we should wait to see how that happens before we do anything to do with tax. I'm less of that view. So it is something that we have, again, we've been talking about, and we're looking at that. If it happened, it wouldn't come in before 2026, because we have to, work through all the, again, to a degree of consultation with colleagues. But I think with everything we hear about young people and vaping and the potential risks, I think it's something we have to address. So it's certainly something that I would like to see coming in.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister.
But again, it's quite complicated.
It is,
because it's
absolutely.
What, there's something to do with liquids and strengths, so it's quite complicated in terms of how you do it.
I just wanted to ask, Minister, whether the new Council of Ministers have discussed potentially, for instance, banning smoking. I know with, say, New Zealand, they implemented changes where I think if you're under a certain age, you're not allowed to smoke. And I was wondering whether that would be potentially part of a future government plan.
We haven't, I don't recollect any discussion along that line at COM, and I haven't heard anybody discussing it, so I don't believe it's on the agenda. It's not to say it isn't on the agenda, but I'm not aware of it. I haven't been involved in any discussions involved in that.
Thank you very much, Minister. Moving on to on-premises alcohol sales, could you just explain a bit about the tax relief and the purpose of this policy?
On-premises alcohol sales.
Alcohol sales.
Which, is that just general
Potential work.
tap relief? Yes.
Yeah, so we have been working towards tap relief across with this minister and the previous minister. We trying to understand how it works in the UK, but how it would operate in Jersey as well. In the meantime, whilst that work proceeds, Council Minister Spurr's alcohol duty this week, and there is also in place, of course, the small brewers discounts to levels of to levels of duty placed on, for example, beer.
Yeah.
So they are there, but we have been working towards what they may look like. They're of course limited, given that not all drinks are available on tap. I understand some concerns raised previously relating to those establishments that only provide alcohol by bottle.
Okay.
So we understand those are in place, but we've largely been looking at what the reliefs in place for tap relief are elsewhere. Some proposals, for example, rebate scheme, are administratively costly and very difficult to eliminate any, shall we say, error. But we work does continue on tap relief in the meantime.
So is this line of work potentially for, say, the next government budget, or do you think it'd be probably beyond that?
So I think it will continue through the coming year, maybe in consideration for 2026, but we'll have to consider that against competing pressures for available finances. And in the meantime, of course, there are measures relating to craft distillers in this budget.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Deputy, there has been some work done on, sort of initial work done on law drafting for tap relief. I think the important thing is that the Minister is continuing to engage with Jersey Hospitality in terms of exactly the scope and what that would look like.
Yes, and it has become slightly wider from the initial. It would basically cover any alcohol served in large containers, which apparently does include more than just beer. But as Cora says, it's still something that's under review.
Yep, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, another subject now. Next week, as we know, we're due to debate the implementation of the Pillar 2 proposals, which are anticipated to be passed in this budget. So, as we anticipate increased tax receipts from that area, how will the government ensure that the revenues are not over-relied upon for long-term recurring spending, given their future uncertainty, which is flagged?
That is exactly the concern, and that is exactly our plan for Pillar 2, because you'll see from the budget that we have the base case, which is income that we think is reliable over a period of time. And we have set out our plan for doing that, which is the hospital financing costs. We'll have some implementation costs in the first year, transferring for reserves, and some funds to go into investing in competitiveness for the island. So we're earmarking £50 million over the next 3 years from Pillar 2 to invest in competitiveness. If there is greater than anticipated, we are still proposing on that being used really for infrastructure such as a hospital and reserves. I think it would be unwise to add it to recurring revenue reserve because we're not sure it will recur. How long will it recur? Obviously, we need to, the competitiveness work is about ensuring the island remains a place where people want to stay and do business or come and do business.
Okay, I mean, I have a further couple of questions arising from that, and we've got more when it comes to fiscal policy panel review, but on that, I mean, can you explain the discussion which led to the priorities which you just mentioned, i.e. spending on healthcare, competitiveness, investments and reserves? Can you elaborate on what discussions took place regarding those particular items?
Yeah, I mean, those are the things that we think, and the FPP have kind of recognised that we have taken a prudent approach, and I think they've kind of accepted that as a wise approach. It is about investing into the long term and not for revenue spending. Cora, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, the approach is twofold really, and was thought about very, very carefully. So we wanted to be sure that anything that was factored into forecast for recurring spend, we could reasonably foresee would recur on an ongoing basis. And that's the 52 to 54 million that's in the government plan. And then if we're fortunate to get additional revenues from Pillar 2, there's a lot of behavioural change aspects to Pillar 2. Then the government plan also sets out what would be done with the upside that comes from that. So on the approach to the forecast, that was how we did the forecast. And then the decisions about how the spend was made was really in relation to the interest on the financing for the hospital is an important cost that Pillar 2 will contribute to. It's obviously very prudent to put the money into reserves, but also we do need to maintain a focus on international competitiveness in a world post Pillar 2 with the introduction of this 15% rate for these very large multinational groups. So that's why we thought it was very important to allocate some money to that competitiveness project.
Okay, thank you for that. And going on for the longer term, you said what the intention is, but the fiscal policy panel goes one stage further and recommends a formal commitment to ring-fence any Pillar 2 income in excess of the base case forecast for investment in the strategic reserve or stabilisation fund. And I mean, are you, Minister, able to give that commitment?
So far as possible, well, that is our plan, is to try and build our reserves to use that.
I mean, I'm saying that the panel concluded you hadn't actually given it as a formal commitment. Is that what would you be giving that commitment?
Well, firstly, of course, the plan for those uses are laid out in the budget. They include allocating to reserves, but they also include part funding of the new hospital facilities, and they also set out, dependent on how large those excess receipts are, allocating them towards future infrastructure as well. So that it is one of the prime parts of the plan that says that's where excess receipts would be applied, but it's not the only one.
Okay,
What we have said is that you shouldn't spend it on recurring spend because you don't know whether you can bank upon that income into the future. But what we have said is that infrastructure, in particular the hospital, and reserves are priorities for those excess funds, because by doing so, you're not creating future commitments to revenue.
Without
Yeah.
guaranteeing. Okay, well, I've got a couple of questions later on stabilisation funds, so I'll leave it to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to hand you back to Deputy Gardner, who's got some questions about prioritisation before she moves on to public sector spending.
Thank you, Chair. Before I move to the public sector spending, I will stick a bit with the revenue. And I was listening for the questions and for the answers. And at least 5 things I wrote down. So we have a vaping tax duty under discussion. We have a tap relief duty under discussion. Prices for off licenses under discussion. Carbon tax on private aircraft under discussion. And actually we didn't mention, but it's been in the public domain, windfall tax under discussion because it was the Deputy Kovac amendment that was brought into the government plan. So we have under discussion
Tax.
The land tax.
the land tax.
Oh, right, okay.
The land tax.
Sorry.
So we're talking about at least 5, 6 different options for raising funds to address our pressures within health, if it's through alcohol or smoking, to address pressures within the carbon neutral through the private aircraft. What I realize with this is all under development and policy under development and the consultation for the last 2 years. Realistically, what can we see included in the budget for 26? Which part of these work streams can be finalized by the next budget?
So we've got a commitment to bring proposals in respect of vaping to the Council of Ministers in 2025. And so that would,
Vaping?
if proposals are taken forward, they would expect that
Sure.
to be in the plan for 2026. Interest relief, that would be a matter for consultation in the coming year towards 2026. Wider aspects relating to carbon tax I expect to be in the next government, but we'll continue to work towards them. Remind me where your list is at.
Land tax.
Tax relief, tax.
Is that the interest relief one or the?
No, it's when.
I think we'd have to come back to you on that
Kovac's
one,
proposal.
unless Cora.
I don't have an update on
So I think that.
Oh, that's, I think
that is
the-
in working
do
with
know
the
that.
Environment Minister. That one.
I believe the last exchanges we had on that was that the land development tax is sitting with the Minister for Environment. It's for him to develop that policy, but it is not at the top of his list of priorities at the moment. He has other priorities he has to focus on. And I would just challenge, I think all of those things that we talked about, they are not all about revenue raising. They're not necessarily all designed just about raising revenue. I mean, fuel duty replacement is. Vaping tax isn't just about revenue, it's about dealing with public health issues of vaping.
Absolutely, this is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Tap relief is about supporting hospitality. That's not revenue, that's reducing revenue. That may be cutting revenue rather than increasing it. So I'm going back to the whole thing about are you consulting, are you listening? We've got to have time to do all of that as well. You know, if we just launch something next year saying we're doing this, and you'll be complaining that people have told you we haven't consulted with them. So it is a long term, and we can't, until we've done the consultation, you can't necessarily know what the impact is going to be for 2026.
I absolutely understand, and this is why I mentioned that it's a lot about sustainable finance of health, it's sustainable finance of the policing, it's sustainable finance of the environment. and just the question was around, it's impossible to do everything.
is
already
impossible,
what
and we have got
and
to
this is why I ask about
prioritise,
what we
yes.
can see actually materializing after it will be 3 years in the budget 2026, but I got the
I
answers.
don't see any of those things coming in before 2026.
Sorry?
I don't see any of those things being effective before 2026.
Not before, no.
No.
Into the budget, but
The budget for 2020.
budget
Budget
for
for
3 years,
20,
yeah.
what I won't be doing so for example, in June 2025, I don't expect to be saying from tomorrow we're taxing vapes, or, you know, it will not happen in that timescale. So by the time we go through the legislative changes, the tax will not actually be effective until 2026, time we've gone through consultation and drafting and working out impacts. It would be at least 2026. And we have got, the team they have some quite chunky priorities at the moment in terms of Pillar 2, getting ready for independent taxation. There's a third, which has gone out of my head.
So, yeah, Pillar 2 independent taxation and the things you've mentioned are on our current work plan.
Yes.
There are lots of other things that have been suggested to us, but as the Minister said, that is quite a chunky work plan, and we're very focused on developing it to stages where we can give it to the Minister for review. Doesn't necessarily mean every single one of them will end up being proposed, but the work will have been done to give a recommendation to come on them. So those are on the work plan at the minute.
So the work we undertake with the Minister is rather similar to that with the legislation pipeline. There are a number of areas that people wish us to look at, and we have a level of resources. So we go through with the ministerial team their priorities for the coming Parliament.
It's completely understandable, and the only thing why I'm raising this, because this discussion's going for 2 years and we'll have another year, and just try to understand what can materialize in practice. But let's
All
go.
of those things have been
Sorry?
talked about. I don't think all these things have been talked about for 2 years. I mean, we had a discussion, well,
Some of them,
started
they're
talking about
different,
last
yeah,
year, and they
Okay, let's move to the public spending. And
Okay.
before we move to the public spending plan for 2025, 2020, I would like first ask question about public sector spending in 2024. How the tangible benefit to islanders from the public spending for 2024 is monitored and measured.
How the tangible
How benefit
By
from
the-
to the public, what we are
by the
spending in
ongoing- by the
2024
ongoing
is measured
delivery
and
of-
monitored.
So,
ongoing delivery services, sure.
as the panel will be aware, the priorities of government are set within, I'm going to get my acronyms right, CSSPs. They are then followed each and every year through government plans. Where those matters leave to, should we just for shorthand call it growth, and or capital programmes, they are subject to business cases. Those business cases will have benefit realisation within them, and therefore you can look further down the line to
No, my
look
question
at
not
what
about the
those are.
process. Apology. My question was specifically, we're spending in 2024 agreed funds we have above billion budget.
Yeah.
How the public spending, monitoring and measuring the public benefit, what public out, how the money's been spent, how it's monitored, how it's measured,
So monitoring spend or monitoring outcomes arising from spend?
outcomes.
So outcomes arising from spend are set in the future outcomes frameworks and knock all the way down through
Specifically,
to key performance indicators. So you would expect government spend, for example, in education, to be targeted towards whatever the key performance indicators that arise from the future outcomes framework lay down for example, improved grades or improved SAT results or whatever they might be in the future. So there should be alignment between the key performance indicators and those future outcomes. The monies should be spent, therefore, to deliver those outcomes, and monitoring of key performance indicators is, of course, published quarterly.
can you provide some examples from public spending in 2024, the benefits to the public? Examples, just to get
Well,
the
I
good
think,
understanding.
I think it's very difficult. I'm not entirely sure I know what you want the answer to be, because surely the answer is delivery of services at a level acceptable to the public. Now, if we'd announced in September that only 5% of children had got a GCSE at A to C, then clearly education has failed and the money has not been spent wisely. But when you're announcing results that are kind of in line with benchmarks elsewhere, that would show that our education system's working adequately or well. We've got people coming out of hospital who have had their operations.
We have Government Plan 2024-2027. There were change of the priorities, which we understood and accepted. How we know how this money was spent on what services, how it's communicated to the public, how public knows that 57 million in infrastructure, what it was spent on.
So that's
That's an annual report, isn't it?
that's a-
Annual report.
No, but
That's a
during
massive-
during the process, during the year, like we are 10 months inside the year, how public can understand where the money is going through the year, during the year? Publish progress update, because we are not publishing progress update during the year.
We're not, no.
So we don't have published progress update on public spending during the year.
No.
How do we know what's happening? Have we done that previously?
So,
Yes,
for a
yes, we
couple of years, there were some mid-year financial and updates against the delivery of priorities. Your question has been more fundamental to that, which is what are the outcomes that arise from the total 1.3 billion spend? And that's, I think, where my answer was going towards, which is the publication of key performance indicators. Without those and the progress against previous years' performance indicators, without the funding, those departments can't deliver those services. In terms of progress, in terms of what's delivered with the spending, I regard that as an element for the annual report and accounts.
But we did
It's
have
quite-
mid-year progress update before. Why we don't have it now?
In terms of prioritising activity and putting our activity towards those things that make most difference in the back office, of course, current year we've had a new government and putting together a new government plan. We're very shortly now heading towards the preparation of the annual report and accounts. And we've deprioritised certain things that previously were undertaken. It was only done for a couple of years. It wouldn't actually tell you all of the progress that was made through the spend of the 1.3 billion or the 1.2 billion revenue budget. It would just tell you where the spend was at in previous years.
But also, everybody is still everyone is still subject to the public finance law. So if a department has a budget, departments are given budgets under heads of expenditure, and they can only spend the money for the purpose for which it was allocated unless they go through formal processes, I believe, and Nigel explain that a bit more. But if money is allocated people can only spend money for the purpose for which it's been allocated, and they've got rules around regularity and propriety and all that.
It's interesting what you're
I-
answering,
I'm
because
not
if I'm
quite sure.
I mean, looking forward, Minister, maybe Treasurer, the documents, both the annual report and accounts and the government plan, are fairly static documents that paint a picture in time. Do you think maybe for 2025 and beyond there is scope to look at more flexible, more agile ways of reporting mid-year? And do you think that would be of benefit to the public?
So I have my own views in terms of priorities, in terms of what a finance function delivers, and those would be lower on the list than some of the things you might expect from a well-functioning public finance management function. There is a great deal of work that is undertaken to produce the level of detail that's in the annual report and accounts, or the level of integrity that's within the annual report and accounts. And we are committed to delivering departmental reports that will provide more information in the future. But to do that on a regular basis means you're almost painting the fourth.
That's helpful. Thank you. That's
And
fine.
I also think mid-year information might actually, You know, you could have a department which midway through the year is massively underspent, but we know because of the way their cash flow works, they will be fine by the year end. And I think producing mid-year information with all the nuances of what happens with money and spend during the year, people could be saying, oh, well, there's a big underspend over there, so why could you spend that money? And it opens up discussions
very
that
helpful.
are
Thank you.
perhaps not on an accurate basis of
Thank
fact.
you. I think we need to move on. So.
Minister, I would like to probe a bit more your views that the funds that were allocated for specific purposes and were agreed by the States Assembly spent according to the States Assembly decision or where it was allocated. It is our understanding that any revenue growth allocation from the previous budget year remain within the departmental heads of expenditure. Should a project or program be dropped, the money allocated to that specific program remain within the head of expenditure, but is no longer used as previously designated. And I have a couple examples that I can give. For example, from CNAG report about economic, social and health related recovery from COVID pandemic, it was clear findings that CNAG was unable to assess how well some of the schemes were managed and resources were spent. Also unable to assess whether some of the schemes achieved objectives set out in the approval business case. So basically, the money was put within the department's head of expenditures for specific COVID recovery, but it was no trail whatsoever how this money was spent.
But that must be a budget that happened in 20 or 21, and we're talking about the 25 budget.
What-
So I'm not quite sure what.
No, what I'm trying to, Minister, please stay with me. I'm trying to explain what I'm talking about. Even from this budget, the funds were allocated 3.5 million for therapeutic children homes, for example, within the growth for children's services. The therapeutic children home was stopped, but the money still remain within the department for the growth. They might be reprioritized and reallocated. I would like to speak with, to understand from the minister, what options do you propose to make sure that the funds that were allocated for specific projects or budget would be used, and you would be reassured that all departments have used this agreed funding for specific and not got into the whole budget and spent on whatever is right for them?
I think the Minister for Children made an announcement this week about therapeutic facilities. So he has possibly decided to do that in another way. I think there are technical processes around transfers of funds from heads of expenditure. If money is allocated for a particular purpose, if it is not going to be used for that purpose, it has to go through a formal accounting process to be moved somewhere else. And I do think that's a technical accounting
But because we
point.
don't have clear granular departmental plans and granular departmental spending, we personally don't know. I think the public doesn't know how this money was spent. I think another example, it has been allocation for the public ombudsman from whatever, but we know the reasons. We are not going into the political debate, but the funds are still there. And do you know how the funds that were not spent on the public ombudsman this year would be spent?
So that's an accounting point. Andy, can you
So I can go into a bit of detail, and I think you're talking about growth allocations, and there is a process by which amounts that have been allocated in a budget for a specific purpose for growth, they are tracked in the year. So each department has to report on how much has been spent against it. As the Minister said, it can't be spent on other things without a formal decision. So the Minister can agree to repurpose that growth if the department requests it. In terms of the Ombudsman, that was growth from, I think it was Government Plan 2020, so it was a long time ago. And there is a balance in terms of you can't continue to track all growth ever because it becomes an amazingly large undertaking. It would be far too administratively burdensome. So that is now rolled into departmental base budgets. I do believe that actually the money as part of sort of rebalancing funds within the department is now is not going to be spent on the ombudsman. It will be used or removed as part of
Then
delivering the savings that need to be made to allow the department to be more focused.
Very helpful clarification, because this is exactly my point, because from growth that was originally allocated, it's rolling into the overall departmental budget, and without clear granular reporting, we don't know.
Very difficult for us to
It's very
scrutinise
difficult to
where that
track
money's going.
if it was spent on what it was allocated originally, or it's gone into the.
And particularly if the growth has come on the back of a state's decision or the state's proposition.
So there is it's established practice that it rolls into the base burner period, and I says that from initiative, because otherwise everything would become very, very complicated to track. I think it's an interesting one, and there's been previous conversations with the CNAG around the way the public finances law is structured.
Yeah.
So heads of expenditure are quite broad, and there are responsibilities for accountable officers set out in that law, that they are responsible for regularity, value for money, propriety and others. So that means that they look at their overall budget and use that to deliver the objectives and priorities of ministers, including delivering.
So I think what you're saying is the accountability then comes into the accountable officer to make an assurance to the minister that the money has been spent in the way that it was allocated.
To meet the priorities, and that might change, things change over time, so how your base budget is used year on year may not be exactly the same, and it may well be that within the year you need to change exactly how the money is used to meet emerging pressures.
And I think that's our issue in the absence of any departmental plans moving forward or progress reports. It's very difficult for us to assess how those changes have been made and where money has been focused away from its original attention. But I think let's park that there. I'm just conscious of time.
Just a very quick question to close it. It was very clear CNAG recommendation in October 23, and I think it has been accepted, that set out minimum requirements for more granular financial reporting in government departmental reports. So would you agree that it is essential to have more granular detail of spend of the departmental level to ensure consistent reporting to improve this transparency and accountability, how to track how money allocated and spent?
So I would welcome a degree of more granular reporting within departments. Okay. Obviously, there's a trade-off there to the level that you might suggest if we had to track how money that was allocated for growth 10 years ago is now being spent, would be quite an enormous task.
Yeah, sure.
Indeed,
but within the last 12 months.
Within 12 months, there are, yes, so we can give consideration to how that is dealt with in departmental annual reports, or indeed within our own level of reporting for the organisation as a whole. But in terms of what Andrew's just said, there are very clear rules in place and tight rules relating to the spending of that money in the first year to which that growth relates.
Yes,
and the money cannot be, without the minister's permission, used for other purposes. And of course, in terms of capital or projects, it's even more controlled in terms of what the sums of money can be used for.
Okay, thank you.
Just the point on the granularity, what the CNAG from conversations we've had with her is that if you look in the annual report and accounts, the statement of political accountability includes heads of expenditure level, whether or not you've spent your budget. So one of the things that we've discussed is actually going to the next level. So the equivalent of the service analysis in the annex for the government plan, showing a similar table to what you would have in that statement for each department, and that's sort of for the basis of what that reporting is likely to be in those departmental reports.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be very precise if possible, and we'll go through the pages that you can explain in some presentations. If we'll go to page 42, table 11, it's one of your favorite tables,
is one of mine, yeah.
I assume. What specific formula-driven growth factors contributed to 23.4 million increase, and how this growth will be managed and monitored? So 23,429 formula-driven growth.
Yes, just let me try and write back into that to get the detail. I'm wondering whether that might be better as a formal submission, but in that formula-driven growth that's set out is 2% for healthcare, so 2% above inflation, a change to overseas aid allocation, it goes up as a percentage of GVA forecast. It includes I believe, the uprate of the state grant, and it also includes
The state's grant to the Social Security Fund.
to the Social Security Fund.
That's the
Thank you
bottom.
for clarity. And it includes an amount for overdraft charges as well, which are formally driven by the balance, the cash balance in the consolidated fund.
Okay, can I take you to the page 46?
Yep.
Or maybe on page 46? Why on page 46, budget allocated to formula-driven growth is 13.4 million compared to the table on the page 42, which is 23.49?
Yes, so you'll see that the difference is around 10 million, which is due to the reduction in the state's grants that was used to pay for the support to living wage. If I'm honest, it's somewhat unfortunate that that number doesn't say 23.4. That would have been more helpful. But that is why that number was different.
At the 23,
So-
10 million, no, I understood, 10 million for the transition to the minimum, transition for the living wage. You have included in the formula-driven growth, but it's actually
So-
net revenue growth, not formula-driven growth.
So for clarity, before the reduction to the living wage, so going to the formula for the state's grant, the increase would be 23. In the number that's been used in that paragraph, we have then removed the 10. It's basically an error, if that's an easier way of saying it.
Okay,
That
it's an
number
error.
should have been
Okay.
23.4.
No, fine.
Due to...
No,
Thank you for that
now it's
clarification.
clear
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it was not clear. Now, so if I understood correct from the table on page, I think, so, no, I think I got my answers for this one. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. No, was an error and we're not going to get that. Thank you for clarification. So now we are going into,
I think we have a couple of
41, I think, inflation provisions.
41. Yeah, perfect. So I'm a bit lost. Now, if I will go into another thing that I would like to check, and we started to have this conversation at the previous public hearing. You have the growth, the net revenue expenditure growth is 48 million, which is additional new money that actually was added to this budget. So how does it work with us? We've heard about the cutting. We've heard about that the budget is put constraints, stop different projects to make sure that we are balancing the book. But at the same time, by the way, to make it completely fair, we have savings of 20 million, which is 10 million was previous savings, and now we have extra 10 million savings. But the net revenue growth on the page 107 clearly showing.
Sorry, what page are you on?
107.
I thought you were on page
I
41.
thought you were on page 41.
Moved.
On table 56 now.
Yeah, sorry, I'm moving
Right,
too
maybe
fast.
you could be.
Because it was error, it was clearly explained, so I just moved.
So what's the question, sorry?
So what's,
The question, we have 48 million gross, just to make sure that this is correct compared to what been planned in 2024.
So,
Yeah?
Just to make sure that I understood that we have extra 48 million net revenue gross
that's
into this
30
budget.
million of that is the health.
But in total, this is the
Including-
extra.
Including the £10 million for living wage transitional support, which will not be recurring beyond 2026.
But it's still net revenue gross.
Well, it corresponds, in accordance with the way that the COM have put it together, with a reduction in the in what would otherwise be the Social Security, the grant to the Social Security Fund. So there is a reduction in, there is a reduction in how much that would increase by compared to what the formula would have otherwise led to.
So it's a similar thing. It's a slight inconsistency between how that 10 million has been shown. So the 10 million is in the new revenue growth in on page 107, and it would have been adjusted in the inflation and formula-driven growth. So it's slightly inconsistent with the way that they've been shown. We can clarify those.
I think that's why we're having an issue with it. It's just not
Yeah.
displayed in a very transparent way, and you've got three different areas that are showing different things, and we're just trying to work out.
Yeah.
So
You're working out.
It's not. I don't think it's intentional, and I think it's something that we could review when we go to the finalised document to make sure that it is clear and very consistent between them. But it might be worth if we could come back and clarify what it may look like to make sure that
It would be really helpful if you could do that.
hopefully
Yes.
you can appreciate there's lots of numbers that move around, so sometimes these things do slip through, although we do have a process of checking, which we do try and pick up as many as possible.
Okay. And hopefully we've been helpful in that regard with our checking.
Yeah. What are the contingency plans do you have to manage higher than expected inflation, particularly in regarding pay awards and non-pay expenditure?
Well, if you repeat the first bit, I got the end.
I'm moved from these numbers to different area. What contingency plans do you have in place to manage higher than expected inflation, for example, particularly regarding pay awards and non-pay expenditure?
So we regularly do carry provision for unforeseen expenditure. That totals £7 million in this budget, as well as it has in previous year's budget for the following year. We set the pay award, well, the general inflation, the pay award and non-pay inflation in line with the expectations within the FPP forecast. Provisions in terms of any flexibility relate to the contingency that I've just spoken of, that is a total of £7 million.
Okay. Thank you. How might the transition to a living wage impact states' income, means tested benefit payments and inflationary pressures?
So there is work that was undertaken by the economics unit. Iterations of that were undertaken. There's sums in terms of the impacts in total that were arrived at were relatively minor compared to the overall spend in the years. We identify it as a risk within the document, but not included within budgets because they are risk. They are not part of the forecast.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I hand you over to Alex now?
Okay, we're going to move on to a few topics, including depreciation in the Central Reserve. I don't know who from your team, Minister, wants to answer this one. It's as much for the public as well, for their understanding. But how are the estimated uplifts in asset values factored into increased depreciation costs for 25 to 2028? And how does this affect the overall budget planning for Treasury?
That was one of the technical questions.
Quite a technical question, hence the team.
So the depreciation number is updated on an annual basis. So we take into account the carrying value of the assets that are held there and look at their useful life. So you referred to sort of the uplift in asset values. That does occur on a cyclical basis, and when it's each asset's reviewed. So if you look at property, for example, they will revalue them. Mm-hmm. So the value of the asset may go up, or indeed it may go down. But they will also look at the useful life. So they may also say, well, actually, this building's okay. It may last a little bit longer. So the depreciation number that goes into the government plan is based on all of that information. What we would expect depreciation, which for listeners at home who may not be familiar, depreciation is basically spreading the cost of an asset over its useful life. So normally straight line, you can just work with it, lasts for 10 years. The cost is sort of recognised over those 10 years. So that's how it's factored in across the assets. Did that answer your question?
It helps. With regards to the new office building, which of course is proposed to be purchased by the Social Security Reserve Fund, is management intended to be by Jersey Property Holdings? And if so, does that play into how asset valuation and depreciation occurs between the two accounts now? or is that largely unchanged?
So,
Between the kind of the management and owner situation there.
so we apply a common accounting policy
Across.
for both consolidated fund where
Yep.
property holding sits and social security funds. So it would
It'll appear in the Social Security Fund from an accounting perspective for depreciation of assets, as it's an asset of.
So we're still working through the exact detail, but I would expect that it would sit as an asset within one of those funds, and depreciation would go through the fund.
I ask as much because, of course, we will find ourselves in an interesting territory where I think the Assembly understand payments will be made on a commercial basis to the fund to provide a return, yet if management's being performed, then actually some of the costs and burdens of the services may be, we are yet unclear where that might be. So whether that was a substantive thought within this element or it's really something that will be ironed out later.
I'm somewhat speculating, but I would imagine if the Social Security Fund buys the property, it would then give government something like a full repairing and insuring lease.
Okay.
So government becomes responsible for the full management and maintenance of the building as tenant. So that would sit with us as tenant and we pay the rent and look after the building. I'm speculating, that's how I expect it to work.
We're speculating, but it could be a fairly clean, you're hoping for a clean relationship in which accounting practices on that asset are separate within the Social Security
I'll
Reserve
go beyond
Fund.
speculating.
Right.
The principles of this are that we're replacing what would be the case had we, were the fund not to buy it, with the position that would be in place with that asset being owned by the fund instead of the third party, and therefore we work on the basis that those costs will fall to the tenant, i.e. government.
Okay, on to the tenant. Okay, brilliant. Moving away from that rather technical area, can you explain how the Central Reserve is utilised to manage unexpected financial challenges and inflationary pressures, and what is the plan for increasing the reserve balance by 2028?
So I just referred in respect of the earlier question relating to variations in inflation, that reserve is there in respect of other unforeseen matters. It is fair to say that in previous years we would have carried forward unspent funds from budgets that bolster the size of those reserves. That will not be the case this year, in that we are anticipating needing to use all our available resources to meet the pressures within 2024, particularly as they are in health, almost entirely within health. So the reserves are largely as they are presented within the report. We have the inflation reserve, which is based upon what we anticipate the inflation rate to be, and we have the £7 million general reserve available for those pressures. They'll be prioritised towards variations in inflation upwards, and in particular relating to the pay award, subject to other pressures as we go through the year.
Great.
In terms of capital, though, we also do expect, and as a priority, there will be unspent capital, and one of the priorities we'd expect to put those unspent monies towards would be to increase the size of the capital risk and inflation provision.
Brilliant, that's helpful. And one question on feasibility and planning. And we note that it's stated within the budget that a gateway approach to project investment decision-making is used. Could you elaborate briefly on what that means in practice and perhaps provide more detail on the criteria that's used to prioritise feasibility studies for new projects through providing examples?
The principles of prioritising differ very little from the remainder of the prioritising relating to capital projects. So projects that are prioritised in the future years of the programme that still require feasibility funding to get to the point of an outline business case, or to ensure that what's envisaged is feasible in the early year of almost entirely in the first year of the plan. We use the gateways that you'd expect through the, I'm going to go acronym now, CPMO.
Corporate Programme Management Office.
Thank you very much. And we use those gateways through which to award the money. The feasibility vote sets out those projects we expect to use the feasibility funds for. The feasibility funds, nevertheless, is a single head of expenditure. They sit with me, and then are awarded once sufficient assurance has been given, or rather procedures followed, so that those funds could be released to the relevant accountable officer for those projects.
Okay. Are you satisfied that that's a sensible and well-governed process with regards to capital projects, having a gateway approach in that kind of deliverability and feasibility through a gateway?
I fear there's a trap there to the question.
It's a question.
Yes, generally,
so
that is the case, yes.
yes, Treasurer, there is a supplementary. Will you be following the same process with regards to any capital feasibility, design planning and development at Fort Regent?
Let me think through Fort Regent. I would expect that it would follow the same gateways, and were it not to do so, that would be a conscious decision to do so. We'll be looking for mitigating controls in place.
Is the current management and, in essence, subcontracting to the State of Jersey Development Company going to ensure that there's adequate comparison to the rest of the portfolio on the same terms of CPMO for that project as infrastructure estates and projects?
It would differ slightly if it was undertaken through SOJDC, in that it would follow their governance framework in respect of the management of capital projects. They have, once capital projects get into the implementation phase, a reasonably good track record of delivering those capital projects.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just some really quick questions in terms of contingency funding. Can you just explain the outlined process for contingency funding and where such funding would be made available, from where, and if you could just give us an example of when you've used that process.
So contingency funding. So the inflation reserve is pretty much as you'd expect. So we'd expect once inflation rate is known to allocate those reserves to departments. In terms of I do enjoy that it's gone back to being called the General Reserve. In respect of the General Reserve, the processes are with the Minister for Treasury Resources. Applications need to be made, and they're made into the Treasury from the department.
Yep.
They are then subject to scrutiny by the Treasury, and then a recommendation to award or otherwise is made to the Minister. And that is done through ministerial decisions, and those ministerial decisions are published. And there is a half-year report. I know some of the members of the panel like some half-year reports. We do a half-year report of all decisions made either directly by the Minister or any delegations to me.
Okay, thank you very much. And the final quick question I got there is the emergency incidents. Can you just identify how any measures in this budget support major incident recovery and actually enhance overall preparedness, and any specific proposals to improve resilience and recovery in response to major incidents?
So we have some funds, Andrew, correct me if I'm going in the wrong direction, within the current year that they're currently ring fencing to be carried forward into the next year for those particular incidents and work arising from them. In terms of when any of the investigation element of that becomes an actual court case, then it will be from within existing budgets for departments or a call upon the court and case cost reserve.
Okay, thank you.
Which is also a carried forward sum that we have.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take you back to
some quick questions on the
Curtis.
state's borrowing. And the FPP notes that the gross debt to GDP ratio, that is our public debt, will raise to 17% in 2025, and that this represents a significant increase in recent years, with a ratio quoted at 5% in 2019 and 12% in 2024. Considering the cost of borrowing, what is the profile of the government's current and future debt, and how is this being appropriately managed under the present economic circumstances?
So we set out in the government plan the proposals in respect to the additional debt arising from NHF1, New Healthcare Facilities Programme Phase 1, which is predominantly the build at Overdale. Those are the only plans within the government plan, but they build upon the existing level of debt. We take advice as to what level of debt capacity there is for government within reasonable expectation of not leading to an increase in the cost of that, which would probably come through any future downgrade were we to exceed that level. So we keep that updated. We're doing an update currently. We are confident that this level of debt, which is obviously known in the plans by S&P, wouldn't lead to, in itself, to a downgrade in the credit rating. But we do and are working on, alongside long-term capital plans, sustainable ways that would be resourced, which may well include in the future further debt, but would give consideration to how that would be repaid. So our principles are generally that we are clear that any debt has a plan for repayment, doesn't overstress finances for government for this generation and future generations, and is affordable.
Okay, and I think picking up in there, I think I felt, Treasurer, that you're satisfied that this is within our debt tolerance in essence,
Yes.
the level of borrowing.
Yes.
Do you feel we're close to where we would be breaching your tolerance for debt?
We're closer.
We're closer.
But I still think we have headroom above that. But as I say, it's very important that there are robust plans for repayment of any debt that is brought forward.
Well, what measures are in place to ensure the return of unspent funds to the consolidated fund in order to minimise the borrowing requirement? And this may also be specifically from the revolving credit facility, given the mechanisms.
I'm not sure I quite follow the question.
Okay. In essence, where funds are unspent, what measures will be in place to ensure that these are returned or drawn back? I don't know what the opposite word of drawn down off our facility is, to minimise excessive borrowing costs where, for example, we draw, or is the anticipation that we only ever draw money when it is absolutely needed, but there is no plan to then reimburse on an ad hoc level?
So we have, if I could point backwards firstly, that's exactly what we did in respect of ensuring that we didn't overborrow and continue to borrow beyond or through a phase where we were carrying balances on the consolidated fund. And then this is indeed part of the reason that we haven't been able to, as quick as we'd like, place more funds into the stabilisation fund, because first and foremost, we prioritise repayment of the COVID debt. So as we've come from through COVID, we would have originally anticipated that debt would have been required for longer. As it turned out, the recovery from COVID, as well as the impacts during the COVID years not being as severe as could have been the case, have allowed us to make sure that we repaid that debt. That's actually, to answer your question, that's actually what we do to make sure that we're not over borrowing at any point in time, or not significantly overdrawing. We are looking, when we draw down debt, at the latest forecasts of spend from the hospital team, and we keep that under regular review and then rebalance as we draw down subsequent funds from the revolving credit facility. I hope all of that made sense.
That's great. I'd love to ask more, but I will move on
Okay.
to the state's funds. And reflecting on a previous panel's recommendation, it was recommendation 24, in line with the recommendation by the FPP, the Council of Ministers must ensure that the objectives of the state's funds are clear and that policies are adjusted in line with this objective. So around the accountability, the objectives of funds. Has a work plan been set out in 2024 to review the objectives and the associated policies of funds?
Our first priority in doing so has been towards the strategic reserve, and this budget sets out a revised policy for the strategic reserve that is largely a rationalised policy of those that have been agreed by the states through numerous different decisions previously. So that's the first of the reviews in terms of the purposes and rules and procedures around funds that we've undertaken.
Okay. Are there many more funds expected to be reviewed from the work plan? I note that the response from the government included a work plan will be set out in 2024 with priority given to the most significant funds, plural. So I'd expect perhaps a few are being worked on.
Within our direct control. The next one would be the stabilisation.
The stabilisation, okay.
Thereafter, it would involve involvement of Social Security Minister in
Looking to their
particular
funds.
regarding the Social Security Fund, but that would be further on.
Further on, okay. The FPP, in its annual report for 2024, also reiterates the importance of the reserves fund's value and liquidity in both the cases of the stabilisation and strategic reserve funds to function as intended in times of volatility and shock, noting that these reserves were established to counter the risk of government's dependence on the financial sector, which is, of course, outside of Jersey's control. How has the government strengthened its commitment to replenish the reserves to appropriate levels and maintain liquidity?
So there are aims set out within the budget. Sorry, Minister. There are aims set out within the budget to grow the strategic reserve in the long term, and more immediate specific measures off the back of previous FPP recommendations related to future prior year basis receipts being allocated to the strategic reserve. Previously, they've been used, in particular in the latter impacts from COVID, to bolster the reserve, the funding available for capital. The document also sets out that one of the priorities is to use any excess receipts arising from Pillar 2 to bolster the reserves also.
Okay, great. And one more question reflecting on the FPP. And they also note that, although pleased to see the capital budgets at a more realistic level, it would have been preferred that the saving from this approach was used to strengthen the stabilisation and strategic reserve funds rather than being spent. Was this ever considered? And if so, what was the rationale for not following such an approach? Maybe this is one for the Minister first.
I'm on a roll.
Carry on.
So it was considered, and it's a balance of the needs. Equally, spending funds on infrastructure are a priority that the FPP would also support. So it's a balance of needs across the pressing needs arising
I think some of the balance here as well is not necessarily on more for infrastructure, because they were pleased about what they see as a slightly more realistic capital spend, but that actually that reduction in ambition, whilst they consider reasonable, hasn't resulted in banking those savings as such, and has seen them convert into spending elsewhere.
It's not a reduction in actual spend, it's a reduction in budget available. That budget, we've set them to what we expect overall to be spent, and indeed in 2024 we expect capital budgets to be underspent again, further to budgets that are not deliverable within our capacity, or in some cases within the economy's capacity. So
Okay. It's about reality versus forecast.
yes.
Partly. Brilliant.
Yeah,
I'll
it's
hand
about
back.
the difficult balance that the FPP themselves recognise.
They do. I'll hand back over.
Minister, question to yourself, and it's going back to the strategic reserve that we already talked before, but I would like just to understand your position. FPP notes, and I look through the table that presented to us, that strategic reserve in 2028, okay, if we're looking through the plan, will only be equal to 17% of GVA, and that the cash value will be lower still. Compared to GVA, I mean, the target was suggested by FPP is 30 to 60%. So we'll have in 28, 17 compared to suggested target. How comfortable are you with this level of the reserves?
Well, clearly it would be better for it to be more, but to take large amounts of money out of spend to put into reserves is going to be very difficult without cutting services. So I think what we have done is set out a sensible plan as a way of starting to build our reserves using prior year basis debt and what we can where we have Pillar 2 funds. But I think again, it's the balance between public services and what we've got available to invest. And we are trying to do that. It would be good to have more. But as long as people are coming saying, we want this, we want that, we need you to do this, it's very difficult. And if somebody's saying, I really need this money right now to support health or education or ambulances to say, well, I'm not going to give you for that because I'm going to put it in reserves, that's a very, very difficult discussion. So we do need to reach that balance, and we have a plan which starts that. If we have the continuation of trying to restrain spending and using any underspends we do have, but it is a difficult balance. And yes, it would be good to increase it, and that is in the long term what I think we would all like to do.
But the long term, if we are talking about 2028, it's 4 years, it's like short term in this. But by 2028, we will be 17% compared to suggested 30 to 60.
But
So
what is that in numbers? Do you know what that is in numbers? If 17% is X million.
No,
and
but
30%
Minister, we are talking about the percentage because FPP very clear in the report that between 30 to 60. So basically, are you agreeing with FPP suggestions or you're not disagreeing with FPP suggestions?
I agree with the suggestion. I think their recommendation is very difficult to argue with. What I'm saying, the reality of getting from 17 to 30 is very difficult. That's why I'm trying to ask what that number is. What's the difference between 17 and 30?
So the balance is forecast to be 1.3 billion, just over 1.3 billion by the end of 2028. That's based on the GBA forecast that FPP
Yes.
have done. That's where the 17 comes from. But you need to not quite double it to get to the 30% that's talked about.
So it's how do we find that money from?
How you mitigate the risks that violating of the funding shortfall will be managed, because we do have lots of uncertainty on the geopolitical levels. We don't know how the Pillar 2 will work out, and we know that the main income from the finance industry. We don't have enough reserve if something major will happen to actually help the island. So the question, what mitigations have you put in place?
we have.
So if I may, the forecast shown in the government plan is the prudent approach. So it doesn't include any amounts being transferred in from Pillar 2. So the ministers previously talked about the strategy of using any or some of any, I can't remember what the right term is, amounts above the base case could be used to strengthen reserves. Those aren't reflected in these numbers. So if that does transpire, that number won't be down at 1.3, it would hopefully be a bigger number. We can't tell you what that is because we don't know what the numbers are, and it would be imprudent to start to rely on those. But that is fundamentally part of the strategy of growing the reserve balance, is to ring fence those amounts and make sure that they're not used for day-to-day spending and are used to strengthen this reserve.
That's it. The concern is, Minister, and this is what I'm trying to understand where your concerns, because you are presenting this budget. We do have gross debts, like 70%, which almost compared to 12 that was previous year. We have lower strategic reserves, and we talked about the future generations. So what this government, you as a Treasury Minister, is doing, are you going to do something during this year, or are you just keeping it for the next
We have said what we're going to do in this year. We have said we are going to commit prior year basis debt into the reserves, and where there is upside from Pillar 2, we will commit that into the reserve.
We need to see how it will work out.
That is what we have to do. I mean, I can't produce money without cutting a service. So what services do you suggest we cut? And that is the balance. You know, do we continue with services? Do we cut services? Where do we get the money to put into the reserve? So we have a plan, and we would like, and as I keep saying, everybody plays a part. We could have our plan, but if someone brought a proposition next year saying we want to spend £10 million building a new school in Goree, and the state's members all go, yes, that's fantastic, let's do that. That's £10 million we've got to find from somewhere that can't go into reserves. So, you know, we all have to think to the future. We all have to think beyond. You know, I've been saying all week, I thought the definition at the seminar on Monday from the Welsh Commissioner of sustainability was meeting demands for current spending without prejudicing the ability of future generations to meet their needs. That's a very concise description of what we have to do. We are trying to do it, but we really need everybody to get behind that focus. Now, Deputy, you've been very focused on it, to make sure that we get the focus on building reserves and not just on current spending.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
David?
Yeah, back to the stabilisation fund, if I may. The recommendation 3 of the fiscal policy panel begins, the stabilisation fund is effectively exhausted and cannot fulfil its purpose by delivering cyclical fiscal policy to support Jersey's economy in the case of an economic downturn. It goes on about recommending that further immediate action be taken to improve the balance of that fund. So what are, ignoring Pillar 2 for the moment, because that's not to come in immediately, what are your plans or intentions regarding the improving the stabilisation fund?
Well, I think previous governments have prioritised repayment of COVID debt arising from the pandemic rather than putting money into the stabilisation fund. We thought that was a sensible thing to do. The FPP accepted that's sensible because there is a cost to debt, so paying that debt down was a sensible thing to do, balancing costly debt against money going into the reserves. A contingent transfer wasn't possible at the end of 2023 because there was no income, no excess income. But this year, if there is excess income, that will go into the stabilisation fund. That depends on how departments do, and we will have to look at it at the end of the year in the context of where are the underspends and are there other demands for that money. But that is the plan, and again, it comes down to that difficult balance. And otherwise, it largely is. There will be funds from Pillar 2 base case going in 2026, but the money has to come from somewhere.
I mean, that same recommendation goes on saying that this improvement could take the form of a commitment to investing a proportion of cyclical tax revenues into the stabilisation fund, as well as a commitment to invest a proportion of upside to the two revenues. Going back to that earlier point, taking the form of a commitment, investing a proportion of cyclical tax revenues into the fund, is that something which you are committed to?
It sounds like a very sensible thing that we would all like to do, which is allocate a portion of our income into our savings. But things come up that we can't save, and it comes back to that balance of our tax income is used in providing services. So unless we can reduce the spend on services, and that's what we have started in this budget, we have started trying to constrain public spending. The more successful we are at doing that, that means the more money there will be left at the end of the year to go into the stabilisation fund. So it really is important that we do get it right in terms of extraneous activity, but as I keep saying, one person's idea of extraneous activity is someone else's absolute essential item. So it's how we minimise our spend, how we control unnecessary management, controlling consultants, and making sure that money is spent well. But within 5 minutes, somebody will be saying, we want money on this. We want a new playground, we want a skate park, we want 10 extra beds.
I think that's the fiscal policy panel's concern, isn't it? That will trump it.
And they recognise that. They recognise that themselves, the balance between current spending and future investment for the reserves. But we are really trying to invest. I would love to tell you, I would love to give you a formal commitment saying, yes, I will put 10% of our tax revenues into reserves. But I'll go back and we'll have ministers saying, but how on earth do we do that then? What are we going to cut? So is that question of what does government need to do and pay for? Where does the money come from? Or do you want to increase taxes? Nobody wants to pay more tax. So
I think so. Going back to the stabilisation fund, what should we be aiming for? What figure should we be aiming to keep in it, which is a reasonable amount?
I don't know the historic amounts that we had in that fund, I'm afraid. So
I think previously, pre-COVID, as we were, we'd gone through the first step actually, almost immediately to be followed by the onset of COVID, was we'd put a transfer of 50 million into the consolidated fund. We were heading towards a target of between 70 and 100 million at that point in time, based upon the drawdowns we've seen that would be needed, depending upon the depth of any reduction in economic activity or even falling into recessions in future years. So the very idea of the stabilisation fund is that whilst you're at the top of where economic activity to be putting funds in the stabilisation fund, so that when the economy suffers from a downturn, money can be spent on public services without seeing huge cuts in the services.
Yes, what I'm really getting at is we talk about Pillar 2 and the amount above the base level. There's no point in committing ourselves to whatever might come above it, in the hope that a lot does come above it, if it's going to exceed.
Some of the base case Pillar 2 will go into, base case Pillar 2 is going to go into the stabilisation fund under our plans.
Okay, probably.
So that is being allocated.
So the FPP talk about how big they think it should have been in their report. I think is 80 million is the number that they use. That's where it should be now. It's in a year's time, it'll be a different number again, depending on what's happened in the economic cycle. It's very hard to put it should be 100 million or 150 million. It's more of it should grow and wane with the economic activity the underlying. So we do look to FPP for advice quite often in terms of how much should be in the stabilisation.
I'll leave that aspect of that.
Okay, thank you. We've just hit 12 o'clock. I just have one more question, which is actually a question that came from a member of the public, because we did go out to the public and asked them if they had any questions for you regarding the budget.
Only one came back.
And the question is this, and it would be really nice to have your comments on that. I read recently that it's proposed to raid the Social Security Fund to subsidise businesses to help pay the new minimum wage. I understand that the Social Security Fund was introduced to pay for pensions, sickness, disability and income support, etc. So if the fund is to be used to subsidise businesses to pay the living wage, then pensioners should also be given the living wage.
The pension, I am sure there is a very big theory about what the pension is. The pension is designed to be a base case, is designed to be, it's not designed to match what you would earn in employment. In most jurisdictions, the pension is lower. The reduction in the grant for 2 years will not affect the fund's ability to pay any of those benefits. It's a short-term measure, which is why the fund was identified as a suitable place. But the level of the pension, again, I think our pension is better than it is in the UK and Guernsey, for example. And that's one of the reasons why I personally think we should be focusing on helping people develop their own pension arrangements to save through life to fund their own pensions. And that is a challenge that we have. That particular piece of work, I think, has been deferred because of the living wage, because we can't ask businesses to do too much. But that is, the fund is in very good health. It can pay pensions well into the future. Low-income pensioners are supported through our higher tax thresholds. They don't pay tax. And there are income support benefits to support them. But I think increasing the pension to match what would be a living wage would be a very, very, it would take a lot of work and a lot of actuarial review to make sure that that could be done. And that's a question for another minister, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very quickly, point of clarification.
Oh, sorry, I said something wrong.
Can I revert to the panel on the point that you made, or the constable made, on the stamp duty first-time buyer threshold? Because thinking through it, I think there is a taper in there. I don't think there is a cliff edge, and I would just like to clarify that for the panel.
Thank you. Just before we close, do any of the panel members have any burning final questions for the Minister?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
No? Okay. In that case, Minister, thank you very much. Thank you to the officers too for attending our hearing today. There's a couple of points I think that we maybe didn't ask that we may put in writing, but not huge amounts, and thank you for your very comprehensive answers and for a really important discussion I think today, and help us with our understanding and therefore the public's understanding of how the budget has been prepared.